All right, welcome back to I'll Read It Eventually. And once again, I've done it. Wow, that's going to be really hard to read. This is Kristin Lavransdatter, which is actually a set of 3 historical novels. I'm going to tell you right now, this is going to be, it's very similar to the last book I read. Jeez, maybe I read books other people don't want to read. Very similar to the last book I read in that it's very specific. That one, it was, if you're interested in Anglicanism and church schisms. Well, this book, again, it's called Kristin Lavransdatter. As the titular character, Kristin is a young woman in 14th century Norway, and she's a devout Catholic from a family of devout Catholics. And the story of the book, and it's actually 3 books, the story of those 3 books chronicles her life from the time that she's a young child until the very end of her life in 1349 or something like that. And looking at me, I don't think I look like the kind of person who is interested in family dramas about Norwegian women from the Middle Ages. But I have to say, this book is excellent. Probably 5 stars out of 5. I mean, it's fantastic. It's made up, like I said, of 3 historical novels, all in one bound volume. And the reason for that, the reason that this massive book exists, is because this is actually the Nobel Prize for Literature edition of this book. I didn't know that when I bought it. It's kind of faded, as you can see. But this is the Nobel Prize version of the book because Kristin Lavransdatter, the trilogy, won the 1928 Nobel Prize for Literature, and so it was re-released in 1929, which is what this green version is. It used to have a dust cover. I saw that while I was sort of looking some things up about it, but fortunately for me, the dust cover's hideous, and it's no longer with the book. So instead, you just have this nice old green board. So anyway, the 3 novels are called The Bridal Wreath, The Mistress of Huseby, and The Cross. And what I love about this book is, first of all, and I would never believe I would catch myself saying this, the descriptions it gives of nature. My grandfather used to say that if a book was too descriptive, he just stopped reading it. He said, the book needs to say whatever it's trying to say, or it needs to stop. And I lent him books when he was still living that he read a page of and said, this isn't for me. So this book almost certainly would not have been for Grandan. Sigrid Undset, who's the author, she is obviously, by her name, you can tell she's Norwegian. And what she does is just gives this really incredible set of descriptions of the place that she's describing. A large portion of the book takes place on a manor in north central Norway called Jorungard, and it's a farming community that's run by a member of the minor nobility. And so there is descriptions of the farm year and the harvest and the festivals that take place, and so there's a huge amount of description of the natural world, the things they're growing, the types of trees there are, where the river is, the way that the human created architecture, churches, bridges, houses, all of that sort of interacts with or sits within the natural world. There's descriptions of the hills around it because it's a dale, so it's surrounded by all these big rocky hills and mountains. And so the world, the geographical world within the book, it's not a character, but it is a very vibrant backdrop to what's going on. There are several places like Jorungard, and there are a couple others that are described in the book that come alive, take on a life of their own almost, because of the way in which they're described. So, for instance, Kristin's, let's see, how are they related? I don't remember. there's some very complicated familial relationship. But anyway, Kristin, when she's a young woman, becomes involved with somebody who's like her great aunt or something like that. And her great aunt is believed by the folk living around to be a witch. And her home is described to Kristin by other people. And it's described as this like really dark, kind of fell place that's, you know, super sketchy, and the exact kind of place that a witch would hang out. And then eventually Kristin goes there, and it's not that at all, right? And Kristin realizes that what they mean by witch is someone who understands herbal remedies, and is maybe not a very devout Catholic. And that's pretty much it. And also just sort of an independent woman as well. And so the descriptions of these places just give this enormously important, they call it sense of place in a novel. But that actually matters, because what you eventually get by the time that you're, 800 pages into an 1,100 page novel is you're getting descriptions of events that are taking place in the novel, but they're taking place in rooms that you've been before, right? And within the novel, it's rooms you've been before, but 30 years earlier or 50 years earlier, and so it's not just described as, oh, that's the winter hall at Yorengard. That's the winter hall where her father died, right? And that gives all this meaning, it ports all this meaning into some of the scenes in the book. So, really cool. It's very pastoral. It's very... Clearly, Sigrid Undset was in love with the land. She loved Norway as a place, and that just comes through so clearly in the novel, because it's really about... It's not about towns and cities. There are towns and cities, but the vast majority of the novel takes place in rural places on these manors that are run by these minor nobility. Towns and cities are sort of sprinkled throughout, but they're usually talked about as that place where somebody's been, but it's not where the action's happening. So, love that about this book. Just really beautiful. Some descriptions of wildlife, but really it's just the natural world. Rocks, trees, water, mountains, all of that. So, that's super cool. One of the other things that I really like about this book is that it admits of a spiritual world, and even though the author is very clearly Catholic, and the point of the book is meant to be very explicitly Christian, it's really about betrayal and sin and redemption. It's wonderful from that perspective. But I'll get to that in a second. But it admits of the spiritual world outside of just what the Christian spiritual world contains, especially sort of like a modern Christian spiritual world where it's like there are angels and there are demons and there's God, and that's pretty much it. At one point, and this isn't really a spoiler, but at one point early in the book, it's not a spoiler if nobody else is going to read it. At one point early in the book, Kristin interacts with a character, a figure from Norse mythology, who's basically trying to lead her away into the mountains and imprison her. And she just sees her for a second, right? But it's like probably one of the more formative events of her childhood. And there are descriptions. I mean, I said earlier one of the characters is accused of being a witch. Well, it's because what the author is trying to do is recreate the mindset of medieval Norwegians, which, yes, includes a very well-rounded, full-throated Catholicism, but also includes sort of folk religion and Norse mythology, sort of holdovers from paganism. And there are even interactions with sort of the indigenous is the wrong word, but the Lapps, right? Like the Lapp people, the Sami people, who are sort of like the still pagan. Yeah, they're still pagans. Everybody else in Norway has been Christianized. They're not really Vikings anymore. But then there are people who live inland in what's now Finland and Russia. And those peoples are still pagans. And so when those people are described, they're described as being, barbaric, obviously, but then also as like practicing magic and speaking in a tongue that's of the devil and that kind of thing. But then there are points throughout the book where someone will tell a story or mention something. For instance, there's a community near Jorengard, which is where, again, most of the book takes place or concerns. And they're like, oh yeah, well, that person got married and then they disappeared for like a decade. And it's because they got taken away by the king under the mountain, who's a figure from sort of Norse folk religion. And so the men on that farm, every year they will go out into the forests to try and appease the king under the mountain and bring this woman back. And that's just sort of admitted into the book as being, yeah, that's just real, right? Even though from a very simple Christian perspective, we'd be like, no, that's just not a thing. There is no king under the mountain who's abducting beautiful women so he can marry them instead of, the man she's betrothed to or whatever. But within Kristin Lavransdatter, that's a very real possibility. That's a real thing. So it has those two things together, sort of the natural descriptions of the world and the spiritual geography, I guess you would call it, around the natural geography. Those two things create this really rich backdrop. And then also the Catholicism. I mean, this is a Catholicism that includes very, very clearly the cult of the saints. There's a very, very distinct Mariology. Kristin spends a significant portion of the book praying to Mary. Near the end of the book, she basically asks Mary to redeem her. So, like, very strong Marian devotion. And in the same way that the book admits of the possibility that there are, goblins and elves and fairies who are going to, like, carry people away and things like that, it also is just without any artifice and without any hint of, like, yeah, miracles happen, wink, wink. They're just like, yeah, that guy went on a pilgrimage to that place and he touched the bones of St. Olav and his leprosy was healed. And this is, again, in the 14th century, the early 1300s. So those things provide a huge amount of sort of grounding for the narrative because you've got what is very clearly an understanding of the culture as it existed at the time. And so very rich backdrop to this story. And this story, like I said, takes place in basically 3 parts. And I'm not going to try and spoil anything, but that also assumes that you're going to read Kristin Lavransdatter, which it's 1,100 pages long, number 1. Number 2, it is, again, about a Norwegian lady in the Middle Ages. And I'll just tell you right out front, number 3, there is almost no action that could be described as, like, action, This is not a John Woo film. This is, it's not a soap opera either, but it's very much interpersonal drama. There's not a whole lot of, like, stabbing and fighting and things, being blown up by catapults and stuff. It's very interpersonal, which I find really enjoy. But the book is split again into these 3 parts. You have the first section of the book, which is called The Bridal Wreath. And basically the synopsis of what's going on there is Kristin's a young woman, and she, near the beginning of that book, reaches the age at which her parents are sort of like, okay, you're probably about at the age where you could consider getting betrothed to someone and getting married, right? And her parents very much want her to be on board with whoever she's marrying. And so they're willing to sort of let her have a veto over that. And so she has, a couple sort of, like, misadventures in love, like crushes and things like that don't go the way they're supposed to. But then her father's like, oh, hey, I found this, guy from up the dale, and his family's really great, and our family's really great, and actually, if you go back, 3 generations, we're actually, related, but in a way that's okay according to the Catholic Church, and so, like, you guys should get together, And so she's betrothed to this guy, and she's kind of like, he seems fine, I suppose, I don't know. But she basically asks for some time before she gets married, because she's a teenager. I mean, she's really young. And she asks for some time, and she goes and lives in a convent for I don't know, 3 years to like finish her education and sort of just like see a little bit of the world before she gets married and spends the rest of her life having kids and, you know, keeping a manor and running it alongside her husband to be at least. And of course she meets somebody else, right? And so the book really centers around that conflict of like, okay, well, is she going to marry the man that her father's like, hey, this person would be really good for you, and this is the kind of person I would choose for you, and I like, her father's like, I really like this guy, and we get along well, and he respects me, and I think he's great, and his family seems great, and we love one another. Or are you going to be with this person that you have this like burning passion towards, and even though that person, I don't even really want to say might not be best for you, is certainly not a good choice for you. And so the thrust of the book really comes from these family relationships, right? There's a lot of development of who's Kristin, who's her father. Obviously her father's name is Lavrans, that's why her last name is Lavransdatter, because her dad's name is Lavrans. And then her siblings and her mom, and a couple other sort of relatives, and then obviously the man she's betrothed to, the man she's in love with, and some other supporting characters. And so there's a lot of movement between those people and sort of development within their relationships, and they, as people really do, and that's again one of the things that's really incredible about this book, they hurt one another, they disappoint one another, they lie to one another, they sin against one another. And a huge portion of the internal monologues in the book concern how a person can do that to somebody else and still love them, right? And also, how can I relate to God in the correct way if I'm not, you know, for instance, in this book, if I'm not respecting my parents on the issue of who do they think I should marry, right? How am I loving them? How am I loving God? And then, of course, because it's the Middle Ages, you have this layer of family drama. On top of that, you have this layer of sort of romance drama. But then on top of that, and really kind of in the background, I don't know, somewhere around all that, you have the very real moments of life in which one has to rely on God that are sort of portrayed. So one of the things that's really prominent in this book is the death of young children. There are a lot of babies who are born and don't make it to 2 in this book, for a variety of reasons. There are a lot of people who are crippled in this book, a lot of people who die young in a way that's deeply sad. There's a lot of people who, for instance, there's a priest who actually turns out to be a complete scumbag. And so these themes get introduced of, what if life isn't the way that you think it is? What if people aren't the way you think they are? And how do we live with and love those people even when life is not perfect and doesn't fit nicely into the boxes that as a child we were led to believe that it would, right? And that's really what the first book is about. It's just, what if life doesn't fit into the boxes, right? What if I don't turn out to be the kind of person I actually thought that I was? What if the things that I said were really important to me? My family, the opinion and respect of my parents. What if those things don't actually matter to me at all? And I just thought that they did until I found something else that I now decide matters more. And what kind of person does that make me? So, really, really excellent book. Took me a long time to finish because I started a seminary semester like a month after I started this book. Well, no, probably 2 weeks after I started this book. So I was halfway through the first book, and then I just like stopped for a month. But so at the end of the first book, she does get married. I'm not going to tell you who to, but she gets married, and so she goes to live on the manor that man owns, because both of the men that she's interested in, or betrothed to and interested in, both of them are members of the nobility. So there's no question that she's going to be, a wealthy, well-to-do woman. And at that time in Norway, aristocratic women basically run the household. So she goes and runs the household of her husband, and at this point she's in her 20s and 30s. It's basically what the book covers, is her 20s and 30s. So the first book covers basically from, well, it mentions her birth, but it's really her teenage years. The second book basically covers her 20s to her 30s, and then the third book covers her, her 40s and 50s. And that's rough. But anyway, the second book is about her married life and how the choices she made as a young person influence the way in which her married life goes, right? Because her parents are basically out of the picture, right? She moves to this other manor, and she's spending all of her time there, and so she doesn't see her parents but like every once in a while, right? And so she's basically with her husband, and her husband had kids from a previous marriage, and so that she's dealing with that. She's a stepmom, and she's trying to have her own children, and so she, has her first child in that book, and then proceeds to have 8 more, I think it's 8. She has a bunch of kids, just an enormous amount of kids. And her husband's this important guy, and so he actually goes and fights in a war with the Sami people in Finland, and so he's gone for part of the book, and she's trying to run this manor, and it's, instead of being the concerns of childhood and romance, it's the concerns of career and family life, and do you love your spouse the way that you're supposed to? Does your spouse love you? What do you do if you find out, maybe I actually don't really like this person all that much? How am I going to raise these children? What am I going to tell them to do? Do they measure up to the standards that my parents have? Do my parents' standards matter? Are my standards good enough for them? How am I going to run this manor, which is effectively a business, among other things? And so it is a book, and it's called, again, The Mistress of Huseby. It's a book about working life and family life. And again, it's full of sinners. It's full of people who do things that are wrong. Kristin, by the time that the book begins, she basically ends the first book at a point where she's sinned very grievously, in a couple ways, but very grievously in one particular way. And so she starts the book going on a pilgrimage to atone for her sins, and goes and sits in a chapel and prays to God and basically asks him to forgive her, and specifically not to take out her sins on her child. She's pregnant at the time, and she's like, God, please don't let my child suffer for the sins that I've committed, right? And so there's a question in the second book that was there in the first book but doesn't quite come out as much, which is, how do my sins affect the lives of my children? And so just like a really, and not even in a religious sense necessarily. Obviously the book takes it in a very religious sense, but even if you weren't religious and you were reading this book, the question is, does marrying somebody with the following qualities, does that actually make for a good husband or not, right? Did the things that I or my parents saw in this person actually turn out to be worth marrying them rather than the other person? And what does that do to our kids, right? What does that do to our married life together? And so the whole book is essentially just about what she does as a grown woman and how she's interacting with her children, who are little kids. The oldest one at the end of the book is 12, I think. So little kids, and again, she has a lot that live past, the age of 2. So she's got a whole bevy of kids, right? And, she's interacting with other people. Her husband's interacting with other people outside of their manor, because again, he's a really well-to-do guy. He's kind of up and coming in the world. And, and so they're sort of building this life together. And one of the things that the book, this is maybe my biggest criticism, it's not always clear where the story's going. In the first one, it's like, oh yeah, she's going to figure out who she's going to marry. In the second one, it's just like, what? I guess it'll get to a point eventually. It's pleasant, but it's not going anywhere, right? There's no driving plot. It's just sort of like, yeah, she's married, and it's about her being married. and about, her husband and their children and the people that live with them and all of that kind of stuff. So that's probably my main criticism, actually, of the last two books, is it's just never clear where it's going and when it's going to reach an end point or like a major plot point. They just sort of happen, right? And that is what happens in the second book. About 2/3 of the way through, just like a bombshell drops out of the sky. Her husband does something politically that's just very maladroit and just a completely bad idea. And so it ends up in really bad spot. And she basically spends the rest of the book with the man that she didn't marry, right? So she marries one of those two guys in the first book. The other guy is still attached to her family in a couple of ways. And so she calls on his assistance to try and save her husband from his, political malfeasance, basically. And so that relationship, which you assumed was just sort of over, because it's like, well, she married this guy, and that guy hasn't really been a character. By the end of the second book, major character. And it's very clear that what the author's trying to do is develop a love triangle, right? Where she's married to a man, and there are questions in this book about, well, is that the right person, right? And what is that doing to her, and what is that doing to him, and what is that doing to their children? And then she meets the man behind door number 2, and it's essentially, hey, what could your life have been, right? And that's one of the things this book, at least 3 books, do really well, is they make you think about the question, what could your life have been had you made other choices? There's a lot about regret in these books, especially when it comes to, I did the thing that seemed like it was good at the time, but if I'd really thought about it, I would have realized that was bad, and I would have done the right thing instead. And I regret not doing the right thing. And one of the conclusions that comes through very clearly in this book is, yeah, you did the wrong thing there, right? Like that is said by several characters to Kristin, or by Kristin to somebody else. It's, yeah, you really screwed that up, didn't you? You have to live with it. You have to go on. You have to keep going. You have to, make do with what you've done and what has come from it. You can't just run away from it. It's part of who you are now, right? And so the book, ends with this political malfeasance, and she's got her, spurned man that is helping her save her husband. And eventually they sort of figure out a new status quo. He's not quite saved, but there's a new status quo. And that's where the second book ends. The third one picks up in, basically her children are coming of age, and most of her children are boys. And so she's got all these young men who are turning into her father, or turning into their father, or some combination of the two, or there's someone she just doesn't recognize at all. And again, the question comes up, how good of a parent have I been now that my children are going to go out into the world? Could I have been a better parent, and would that have made their lives better or easier? And then the political malfeasance causes their marriage to sort of take a real sharp turn for the worse. And so most of the book, she's also dealing with severe marital problems, where it's essentially like, am I going to continue living with this person, or am I basically going to say, get ye hence, knave, and never see him again? And then, when one of us dies, the other one will remarry. So it's very sad from that perspective, because there's just a lot of strife and a lot of regret, right? And there's also still this love triangle going on. Eventually the man that she did not marry marries her sister. So he's her brother-in-law, but he's also still in love with her. And so it's just, again, huge theme of the third book, which is called The Cross, is just, what could my life have been? And how do I come to terms with the fact that, like, the choice I should have made 30 years ago, I didn't make. And the consequences of that stare me in the face every single day. How do I live with that? Right? this book does not pull punches on the fact that life is messy, even when you're making what you think are good decisions. They have consequences, and just because you make a good decision doesn't mean everybody has a good reaction to it. And so the book is about her relationship with her children, her relationship with her husband, her relationship with this other man who becomes her brother-in-law. And again, it's not ever clear that the book is going somewhere until it gets there, right? And ultimately, her husband and this other man both eventually pass away in circumstances, and I'm, again, not going to spoil. Maybe at this point you're thinking, hey, this could be a good book, but, well, it is a good book. It's a great book, but maybe you're thinking at this point, this is a book I might actually consider reading. But both of those men die, right? And so the remainder of the book is really about her relationship with her sons, and what they do. And again, how does what she did as a mother impact who they become as people, and what happens to them. And in the background, and also really in the foreground, is her relationship with God, right? And this whole series of books has been struggling with, not only am I a good mother or a good wife or, a good overseer of this manor or whatever, but also, like, do I genuinely love the Lord? There are multiple points where she's sort of forced to make decisions that are bad, right? I mean, at one point, there's a child who's dying, and she has deep feelings for the father in particular of this child, and she basically says to him, because she's kind of like a healer, she knows herbal remedies basically, and they're not working, and she says to him, I know one other thing I can do. And she goes and basically tries to make a deal with a demon in order to save this child's life. According to her understanding, it's like a folk religion thing. But she goes out and does, a pagan ritual to save this child's life, even though she's a Catholic, and the father is a Catholic, and the child's a baptized Catholic. Like, but she says, like, God's not helping this child, and I don't want the child to die, and I have, deep love and respect for the father, so I'm gonna just go do this thing, which is mortally sinful, and just sort of see what happens, right? And so she's struggling the whole book. Does God accept me? Am I good enough? Am I worthy? Some very deeply important human questions. Does God really love me? And where is God in tragedy? Because there's, again, an enormous amount of tragedy. I didn't count, but I would bet that there's probably 24 women or little ones who die in childbirth or shortly after in this book. And that's just that particular population, right? There are people who die at a young age. There are people who are murdered. There are people who are, killed by manslaughter. I mean, there's all these horrible things. And then, of course, there are, people who go blind and people who have diseases. And she ends the book really asking the question, do those things, or do the sins that I've committed, ultimately separate me from God? And can I, Kristin, and also the reader, I think, is being encouraged to ask, the reader, can I be redeemed from my sins? Even though I'm this very complicated, flawed human being, can I be redeemed from my sins? And ultimately, I think the book says the answer is, yeah, you can, right? Even someone who's made as many bad decisions as Kristin Lavransdatter has made, and she makes a lot of bad decisions. She makes a lot of good ones, but she makes a ton of bad ones. Even someone as complex and broken as her, who has failed in a lot of really important ways, right? I mean, you could call her relationship with her parents a failure. Her marriage, you could call a failure. Some of her relationships with her children, you could call failures. Other people, right? Friends, other family members, her sister in particular. Her sister doesn't like her at all. Those relationships could very clearly be called failures in a lot of ways because of the sins that she's committed, the ways that she's carried herself, the things she's chosen to do. And yet at the end of the book says, hey, someone who genuinely brings themselves to God and says, I'm a sinner in need of grace, God doesn't reject that person, is what the book says. So Deeply Catholic book. Deeply Catholic. Right? Again, she's praying to Mary at certain points of this book. But ultimately, even if you're not Catholic, the book lands in a place which any evangelical Christian could agree with heartily. And again, it's a beautiful book. So, highly recommend Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset. Last thing I'll say is that there are apparently 2 translations. I obviously have the older one. I'll just read a line here. The whole book goes like this. "'Twas a shameful thing and an unmanly, so he deemed, if he could not be content so well off as he was in all ways." It's like a little Shakespeare-y. There is a more modern translation of this book from the 1990s, which is probably not as yield Englishy, but this book uses the word trow, like I trow, or in other words, I think it's true that. But that adds something, honestly. So, highly recommend it. 5 out of 5. You should read it. And if not that, go read something else.